And it's only really quite recently that the EU has begun quite seriously to think about liberalizing trade with countries in Asia as opposed to focusing on the international level. And again, the explanation here is the same as in the other cases. Basically, the World Trade Organization basically has become deadlocked, stalemated, paralyzed, and if you want to liberalize trade any further, the only way you can do it is at the regional or some actually, even in the case of God, lower level. And even here it's quite difficult for the EU because, as we know, as we've discussed already, there aren't any really strong regional organizations in Asia who could negotiate on behalf of the individual member states and then implement whatever agreement is actually reached. So when the EU started thinking about sort of, regional trade liberalization and thought, now let's do it with the ASEAN, but they found very rapidly the ASEAN member states couldn't really agree on the terms of any kind of possible trade liberalization agreement with the EU. So even then by default, basically, the EU turned to the individual ASEAN and other individual Asian states to try and negotiate bilateral trade agreements. So meanwhile, there is an agreement between the EU and Singapore, between the EU and South Korea, and I believe there are agreements under negotiation with Japan, I think with Vietnam, and with Indonesia. So again, at this level, there is a certain attempt to basically to forge closer interregional trade ties, but we're talking here about what I categorized before as sort of minilateral relations between a single European actor on the one hand and individual Asian states on the other, rather than with Asian regional organizations as such. And the final thing I'd perhaps like to emphasize about European-Asian relations is there isn't really any security component to them. If you're talking about US-Asian relations, if you're talking about North Atlantic relations between the United States and Europe and so on, security is at the heart of these relationships. And at this level in Asia, basically, the Europeans are simply not present. If you think about sort of the military capacity, intervention capacity of most of the European states, if you think about their relative reticence to actually deploy military force, aside from one or two exceptions, such perhaps as France and the UK, it's very hard to imagine that the European countries, either individually or collectively, could ever basically occupy and perform the same kind of role as a provider of security in Asia as the United States. Or, make the example perhaps more concrete or plastic, could you ever think of Australia, for example, deciding it would rely on the UK or on France or on Germany or on the EU to protect itself instead of the United States? I would be greatly surprised if anyone in Australia could realistically contemplate this prospect. So, that leaves me just a very brief conclusion. I would make 5 points. Firstly, interregionalism doesn't really exist, at least not in the sense of close cooperation between strong regional organizations in different parts of the world. You might nonetheless say that quite close interregional relations exist across the North Atlantic, especially as organized through the NATO. Thirdly, however, as a consequence of the fact that these big international organizations like WTO have become increasingly diverse, very hard to manage, and more or less deadlocked and paralyzed and stalemated, there have been some quite important projects launched to forge particularly close economic ties across different regional boundaries. So as between North Atlantic, as between the United States and the EU and the North Atlantic, and as between the 15 or I think or 14 states that are involved in negotiating the TPP across the Pacific Ocean. Fourth point, I think, is that we can't assume that these projects will ever actually see the light of day. It may well be that the American Congress basically says no to both, and I'd say particularly likely in the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is possible, of course, that if they are adopted finally, ratified, and put into force, they'll end up actually creating new divisions where previously it didn't actually exist. So that would be the case in particular if China were to be excluded or to exclude itself from the TPP. The other thing is, it's very striking, is that both of these projects involve the United States and other regions, but not the EU and Asia as such. So the existing disparity in terms of the strength of interregional relations would be reinforced and exacerbated if these two projects actually do see the light of day and are actually implemented, because nothing similar, nothing comparable really is on offer as between the EU and the countries in Asia. And finally, perhaps to come back to the original sort of point of departure of my presentation, it seems to me unlikely that if we're going to have a relatively stable world political and economic order, we're going to get to this path actually via close, peaceful cooperation between different regions. That means there are perhaps two alternative paths. One would be to sort of carry on having a kind of unipolar order dominated largely by the United States. That's probably the only thing that's really on offer at the all. Second possibility is that a revived sort of multilateral international order basically emerges, in which international organizations like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and so on, play a very, very important role preserving the peace and stability between sovereign nation states. And if neither of these two scenarios materializes, the third outcome might be something like an apolar world order. An apolar world order would be one in which basically there are no strong international organizations, no strong interregional relations based on strong regions, nor strong sort of hegemonic powers like the United States, capable basically of knocking other countries' heads together and keeping the peace and stability in the world. And apolar world order would probably be fairly bad news, because it would mean basically that sort of the kind of conflicts we witness in the present day, such as in Syria, would no longer be contained by any kind of higher, stronger organizations, either of a regional character or of a genuinely international character. We have a few minutes left for any kind of questions, any kind of comments you'd like to make. Yes.
I'll play the third one again. What about regional, non-geographical regions, like the South-South BRICS, all of those? Do you have a feeling that they might build up? And how?
Well, that's an interesting idea. As of course, there are, in some cases, quite close cooperation between countries that are geographically sort of quite a long way apart. The BRICS are on one case. They do actually meet, I think, occasionally and do sort of exchange ideas. At the end of the day, though, I haven't seen up until now any concrete evidence that they could actually agree on and sort of over a sustained period of time actually sort of follow and try to implement some kind of common policy vis-a-vis other states. So, now I don't know that between India and China, for example, that we're going to get a very sort of strong cooperation. So the ties between these two countries are actually rather conflictual and rather difficult. So in actual fact, I would be doubtful if the BRICS would actually fulfill this criteria. You might think also the British Commonwealth in this context, and I was actually somewhat surprised a couple of years ago, I think, to hear the British Foreign Minister, Mr. Haig, a graduate of my school actually in France, saying that the Commonwealth might be an alternative vehicle for the United Kingdom to exercise a kind of world power instead of the European Union. Frankly, I don't think this fell on a very sort of fertile ground amongst most of the other Commonwealth countries. I think probably the Commonwealth is more likely to sort of fall further apart than just to actually grow more closely together. think about the sort of the movement towards having a republic in Australia. That doesn't suggest that the Commonwealth is seen in many other countries, I think, as somehow sort of, you know, a real political entity capable of any kind of cohesive action. Any other comments or questions?
One comment I might offer is that perhaps I'm quite interested in the fact that I think a lot of regionalism happens as a result of crisis. Certainly it's the case in Europe. And you could argue that ASEAN was given a real boost along with the Asian financial crisis. So perhaps global conditions aren't such that you would, it would facilitate region-to-region agreements, whereas perhaps, unfortunately, conditions did deteriorate globally. That's when perhaps think about the landscape might change a bit.
Okay. Do you have any idea what kind of concrete crisis could unleash this effect?
Well, I mean, something economic is the obvious culprit. But it just seems to me that crisis tends to shake things up.
And gave a very good example of the Asian financial crisis having given rise to some sort of impulse for closer regional cooperation. That certainly was the case with the Shanghai Initiative, for example. It was adopted very much against the background of the Asian crisis. It's very important that people sort of see these things in a longer-term perspective. Crises sort of may launch certain kind of projects and sort of discussions and so on. Whether or not, and if you look at what's happened then sort of 10 years later, all that much has changed. Sometimes it's not the case. It is true, in the European context, crises have occasionally given rise to closer integration that has actually proved durable. I can't speculate really as to what kind of crisis might give rise to closer interregional cooperation, except to underline the point, which I think was made, which I tried to make in the presentation, which is that closer to regional cooperation of the kind that we see with the TPP project and the Transatlantic Free Trade project, these two sort of initiatives have certainly been taken against the background of this increasing sort of paralysis of the sort of international multilateral organizations like the WTO, the United Nations, and so on. So these sort of two, this sort of multilateral sort of crisis, if you like, is given a kind of a new life to sort of interregionalism, but unless, as I said, I think you have strong regional organizations that can sort of sustain this kind of cooperation, I don't see very much future in this, frankly. That brings us back to the point, of course, why is it there are strong regional organizations in some parts of the world and not in others? And there, of course, there are essentially sort of like two perspectives. One is that you get close regional cooperation between countries that share a kind of common identity, or there's a strong sense of community. That's the kind of liberal version of how strong regions develop. Or on the other hand, the other explanation typically is that of realist theorists, those who sort of emphasize the importance of power or power relations in international politics. And for them, basically, strong regions basically emerge in regions where there is a single kind of hegemonic or dominant power that also is actually favorable to and wants to promote closer regional cooperation. And from my perspective, the critical point, I think, is that, and what makes Europe so distinctive, is that Germany is a kind of, at least large, if not dominant regional power in Europe, which has over decades, basically, always promoted closer regional cooperation. In that sense, though, it's pretty much the exception to the rule amongst dominant powers than the rule itself. I don't see the United States wanting to give up power to Mexico and to Canada, for example, in the NAFTA.
But yes, you asked for a comment on the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. I'm not too optimistic about it, and I'll just go back to the mid-1990s. I was invited at that point at the US mission to the EU by the ambassador. Had a few scholars there talk about the possibility of maybe doing such a thing. And I guess we went around the table, and the discussion was exactly on whether we could get this thing ratified. And it was also the time when the EU itself was going through a lot of changes and was thinking about its own new treaty and so on. And the decision was, I mean, just talking around the table, that actually it would not be such a great idea right now because of the problems with the ratification. And that it was better to have, a new transatlantic partnership and action plan, joint action plan, which did not need to be ratified. And the whole idea was that this would be very visible. It wasn't, of course. I mean, if you ask students in this room, have you heard of the new transatlantic partnership and action plan? Probably nobody's heard of it, unless I mentioned it earlier at some point. And so it didn't work out. And behind this, actually pushing for this, was Leon Britton in the European Commission. They wanted just this free trade area and so on, which didn't happen. So they went back to, some kind of lower level thing, which they hoped would be successful in raising the transatlantic relationship to a higher visibility level, and it didn't work.
So I think indeed the ratification difficulties for this kind of group will be quite high. Nonetheless, it would be, from my perspective, a very good idea for the Americans and for the Europeans to do something like this, because if you look at the rate at which the balance of power in the world is shifting economically away from the North Atlantic and towards Asia, it would make sense, I think, for the Americans and for the Europeans to actually sort of join economic and political forces to be able to carry on influencing world affairs in the same way they have done in the past. They can still afford to be divided.
It's of course that there's now this big crisis, and maybe, they would unite forces just to respond.
That may, in this sense, maybe it's actually onto a very good idea here.
Yes, so that's to be careful.
Keep an eye on what the European Parliament thinks about all of this and what the American Congress thinks about all of this.
Because the European Parliament is much more powerful these days as well since the Lisbon Treaty, so that's a big change as well. So anyway, see, his story is moving further. But I think we have to stop here, and I want to thank you very much, Douglas, for stimulating our brain so we could go on some more thinking about these issues. I have an announcement to make for those of you who are students in comparative regionalism here. So next time, don't forget, a lot of you have presentations. We're going to move to several parts of the world and so on. If you have any questions, come and see me in my office as well, perhaps today, if you can, later in the day, to look at your papers and so on. Okay? And thank you so much, Douglas. So I think you deserve a warm round of applause.